Hello, and welcome to another episode of Worst to Best. In this series, I rank the studio albums of my favorite progressive rock bands and artists. Today, I will be ranking the studio albums of one of the true pioneers of progressive rock, Yes. Some notes before beginning. I've only ranked Yes's 19 studio albums. This list does not include EPs, live albums, compilations, or box sets. Also, there will be no track-by-track or in-depth analysis of each album. Please keep in mind that this ranking is merely my own personal opinion. If you disagree or want to share your ranking list, please leave a comment. I would love to get your thoughts and opinions. We have a lot to discuss, so let's get right to it.
Open your eyes and discover you're not the only one in disguise. Do you wonder when the change is gonna come?
First up, at number 19, we have Open Your Eyes and Close Your Ears. Perhaps that is too harsh. Overall, this album just seems like polished adult contemporary pop music. It was definitely a letdown, especially when compared to the studio tracks they released prior to this album on their Keys to Ascension albums. Luckily, they proved they still could make good progressive rock with their next couple of albums. This is the first Yes album with Billy Sherwood as a full-time member.
I would've waited forever for you to return into my life. I would've waited forever. I would've given you everything I had. I would've waited forever.
On paper, Union should have been the best Yes album ever. This album features a lineup consisting of almost all past and present members of the band. It was an interesting idea, however, in the end, did not really work in my opinion. Rick Wakeman has referred to this album as Onion because, according to him, it made him cry every time he heard it.
All the magic of the earth and the sky. See, the more we find, the more we realize that every time. See, the laws of nature keep telling us like a friend.
This album continues the sound and feel that started with 90125, but is poppier. Most of the tracks don't do much for me. They're not bad, however, they are nowhere near great in my opinion. One of the exceptions is the very spiritual track Holy Lamb, which closes out the album on a bright note. Guitarist and singer Trevor Rabin originally wrote the song Love Will Find a Way for singer Stevie Nicks to perform. However, Yes drummer Alan White encouraged Rabin to let Yes record the song instead.
Looking around me, there's not so much in life I miss.
This is a pretty solid debut album. It would take a couple of albums to fine-tune their own signature sound. However, the last track, Survival, is one song that kind of points to the direction they were heading. Not a classic Yes album, however, it is a nice novelty to take out and dust off every once in a while. Sweetness was the first song that John Anderson and Chris Squire collaborated on following their initial meeting.
Brave the battle that's before you.
This album is not bad at all. Kudos to new singer John Davison, who does a great job of singing as well as contributing to the writing of 7 out of the 8 tracks on the album. This just feels like a safe Yes album with no real musical risks taken for the most part, which is a shame since their prior album, Fly From Here, was the opposite and far more adventurous. Sadly, this is the final studio album to feature original bassist and founding band member Chris Squire before his death in 2015. Following the fantastic Going for the One album, this seems like a bit of a disappointment. There are some great moments here for sure, however, they seem to be going through the motions at some points. After the tour in support of the album, both Jon Anderson and Rick Wakeman left the group. This was the last album to feature the lineup of Jon Anderson, Rick Wakeman, Chris Squire, Steve Howe, and Alan White until 1996's Keys to Ascension. This album was a total reinvention for the band that was successful in introducing Yes to a younger audience. This was in large part due to new member Trevor Rabin, who brought a whole new sound to the band with his songwriting, guitar work, and vocals. It's definitely more pop than progressive, however this was a crucial album that showed they could adapt to the times. The album title is the allocated catalog number on their label Atco Records. It was 90124 initially, but the sleeve designer said because they couldn't get consistency worldwide with that number, it got changed to 90125. This album is my secret shame. I enjoy it way more than I care to admit. This was the last album with the 90125 lineup. It is commercial sounding, but the material is really strong. Also, Jon Anderson's voice has not sounded this good in a while. Not to mention, the album closes with the multi-part epic Endless Dream, which I think is up there musically with their best work of the 70s. According to Trevor Rabin, TV host David Letterman was driving one day and the song The Calling came on the radio. Apparently, he stopped the car and called his producer to get the album. This was a great improvement over their debut album. There are some great hints of things to come. The addition of an orchestra can be kinda hit or miss. I see this as a transitional album that inched them further to the classic sound, which would come to fruition with their follow-up album. The UK album cover was considered inappropriate for the American market, so a new photograph of the band was used, putting Steve Howe on the cover of an album on which he did not play on.
Your voice is the perfect key. Is there something that I'm supposed to see? Is there something that I'm supposed to feel? I'm with you, and I can't help but want to know.
This album was a welcome return to form for the band. It sounds as though this album was written collectively as a group, something that had been missing for a long time. It's not perfect by any means, however, is important as it proved that they could still create great progressive rock music. This is the only album recorded with 6 full-time members in the band's lineup.
Our heaven will be now. You are the song from the book of time. To realize what is yours is mine. We are meant to be. All because our love has always been. You are the center
This album as a whole is solid without too many weak moments. Since they were between keyboard players at the time, they used an orchestra to fill in the void. The decision to record with a full orchestra was a great idea as it serves the songs beautifully. This, in my opinion, is one of their best latter-day albums. Drummer Alan White plays piano on this album. This is surprisingly an enjoyable album. They sound refreshed and energized. The material here is some of the strongest they've had in years. This was recorded with new singer Benoit David. He does a good job, however I must admit I enjoy the re-recorded vocals and updated production by Trevor Horn released in 2018 as Fly From Here, Return Trip. It only made sense as Trevor wrote a lot of the material. Regardless, this is highly recommended. During their search for a new singer, Chris Squire invited Benoit David, a Canadian singer who fronted the Yes cover band Close to the Edge, to join the band. Squire found out about David after he saw a video of the group performing on YouTube and was impressed with his ability to sing in a style similar to Anderson. This is arguably their most ambitious album, a double album with 4 tracks, each one taking up a side of the album. This has moments of greatness for sure, however, there's a lot to take in all in one sitting. Definitely one of their more challenging albums to get into, however, it is very rewarding once you do. The album was negatively received by keyboardist Rick Wakeman, who disagreed with its structure and elaborate concept and felt unable to contribute to the music that had been written. I love this album even though John Anderson and Rick Wakeman are absent. Definitely their heaviest album by far. It is very bass driven, which I love. Steve Howe's playing is brilliant as always. Drummer Alan White really stepped it up on this album. Admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of his drumming, however, this album is certainly the exception. Highly recommended. Vocalist Trevor Horn and keyboardist Jeff Downs of the new wave band The Buggles replaced John Anderson and Rick Wakeman respectively for this album. This album marked the return of what many consider their classic lineup of Anderson, Howe, Squire, Wakeman, and White. They created a very accessible album which still retains their prog rock style. All the tracks are very strong, culminating in one of my favorite epics of theirs, Awaken. A very solid album for Yes. This album was the first that was recorded overseas in Switzerland. This album follows in the similar format as their Close to the Edge album, with an album side long song followed by 2 roughly 10-minute songs on the second side. The Gates of Delirium track is worth the price of admission by itself. The rest of the album is very strong, definitely a classic Yes album that should not be overlooked. This is the only studio album from Yes to feature keyboardist Patrick Moraz. This was Yes's third album and their first true classic album in my opinion. With this album, they really found their own unique sound. There's not really too many weak areas to speak of. This is overall an excellent album that shows a band that is very much on the rise. This was the first Yes album to feature guitarist Steve Howe. Also, this was the last album to feature keyboardist Tony Kaye, who would later return for the 90125 album 12 years later. This album is Yes's most well-known 70s album, and for good reason. It is an excellent album and certainly one of their best. This album put them on the map and made them a household name. This is the album where everything came together and they had perfected their sound. This version of Yes is arguably the strongest and would remain the same for their next album. This was the first Yes album to feature cover art from Roger Dean. Yes's undisputed masterpiece in my opinion. Not a weak moment to be found here. This album contains all the key elements that truly represent Yes in all their glory. Beautiful melodies, flawless harmonies, imaginative lyrics, and spectacular musicianship are just some of the qualities of this album. Yes has so many great albums, however, this will always be their defining album for me. Sadly, this was the last Yes studio album to feature my favorite Yes drummer, Bill Bruford, until 1991's Union. Thank you very much for watching.